Okay, so I was listening to Sam Tripoli's podcast, and he had a guest on that was um, claiming that Noam Chomsky wanted people um, locked up for not being vaccinated. Um, but that's not what Noam Chomsky said. He said that if people aren't vaccinated, they should um, choose to self-isolate. So that's a completely different thing than being forced in, you know, into something else. And um, so obviously, um, people are using this to then misrepresent um, Noam Chomsky's views in general. Sam Tripoli's then said that Noam Chomsky had changed his life because he had read Noam Chomsky's book, Manufacturing Consent. Um, and of course, that was probably the most famous book by Noam Chomsky, or it was actually a documentary. So maybe Sam Tripoli saw the documentary along with reading the book, or maybe he just watched the documentary instead of reading the book. Because if he saw the documentary, it's I think it's like 2 hours long or something. So probably wouldn't even really need to read the book. But Noam Chomsky has written probably like 50 books on political economy. So just saying that when Sam Tripoli says he just read, manufacturing consent, that's not a huge part of Chomsky's work. I mean, I don't consider that Noam Chomsky's most important work. In fact, I never even read his manufacturing consent book. I just watched the documentary, but I did spend a couple of years just reading Noam Chomsky's books, and the 4 books that I recommend are At War with Asia and um, World Orders, Old and New, and Year 501, Conquest Continues, and what's the last one? Oh, Political Economy of Human Rights. So the last one is actually very similar to manufacturing consent because it's about the propaganda or indoctrination of the corporate state of the US empire regarding international relations and human rights. So essentially, that if the US does something, then we are exceptional and it's with good intentions. Whereas, and if something bad happens, it was a mistake. But the and then the bad things that happen are ignored. The World Orders book, okay, sure. Um, let's see. I read that book like I read the 2 years I spent studying Noam Chomsky was about over it's like 30 years ago. So, World Orders Old and New was published by, Columbia University Press, and, um, let's see if I can remember any details about that in particular, but essentially, that's pretty similar to the Year 501 book, but, um the idea here is that the promotion of the free market is really a big scam because, like, the British Empire had to physically destroy the domestic industries of India and Egypt, specifically the textile industries, because the industrialization of the British Empire was based on the um, use of steam power for textiles, and so in order to have a successful so-called free market, they had to first destroy the native craft industry that was more like women doing working with looms and stuff like that in Egypt and India and Somalia also was a big trader in textiles with China. So you had this ancient global trade in textiles that was a non-Western civilization. And so then, of course, obviously, I mean, I can't remember real specifics about the World Orders book, but I mean, essentially, he's getting into stuff that I learned in my first year of college when I took international relations with a professor at Hampshire College. But essentially, the surplus of oil of profits from oil um, from the Middle East that the U.S. controlled after World War II from the British Empire, that was then used to create shark loans against the so-called developing world. So you had these, you use the Bretton Woods institutions like the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs or GATT or the World Bank. Actually had a distant Swedish relative that did his career at the World Bank on water privatization. And they set up these what they call structural adjustment programs. Um, yeah. So essentially, it's been a well proven fact that the so-called developing countries actually pay way more money in interest on loans than they are receiving from the loans, and so it's an extractive exploitation by setting up these export commodity markets that they call free market zones when they're actually just like slave wage labor zones that rely on military regimes that the U.S. then supports. So, as Noam Chomsky details, the U.S. will then dump food into those countries um, and then tie military purchases to the um, food aid. So in other words, like a local regime will get a discount on purchasing um, U.S. Weapons as some kind of trade agreement, and then they also get food dumping that then just destroys the local farmer markets that are independent. So, for example, in Somalia, the farmers controlled Mogadishu, which is the capital, until Cargill, which is the world's largest private corporation, and dumped food at 15% of the local farm price. So it was one sixth the farm price. And Cargill does that in over 100 countries worldwide. And Cargill's based in my state, in Minnesota, and they're controlled by 14 private billionaires that are related in a family private empire. So Cargill's the world's largest um, private corporation, but they rely on tax welfare because they're paid to store the surplus grains of the U.S. farmers. So the farmers are given subsidies to grow crops, but they have basically no control over the price because it's all based on the distribution that's then used as a what they call food. What was it? Food for Peace was the name of the program, or I think it's like PL 480, Public Law 480. But it was a Cold War policy to use food as a weapon to then destroy local farm markets in other countries to make those countries then dependent on the U.S. For food supply. So that's another aspect of this new world order as an extension of um, and then calling that free trade. So that was one of the we had a big protest against Cargill here in Minnesota, but an activist friend of mine actually blocked the entrance to Cargill by locking herself to a car that was parked across the entrance, and I think she was like 17 or 18 at the time, and she just called herself Freedom. That's all I knew her name, and it got covered on the news for maybe 20 seconds, because the corporate media, they don't want to really discuss because Cargill is a big sponsor of the public news in Minnesota, and the the public schools have been increasingly privatized by Cargill and stuff. So they really try to create this like image of being a good corporate citizen when they're relying on child slave labor to import cocoa and stuff like that, cacao from Africa and West Africa. And anyway, so um, Noam Chomsky was like very much against the use of any kind of detention camps based on political views. And he's as a libertarian, he was very much in support of individual human rights. And in fact, I had a long email reply from Noam Chomsky in 2001, or actually it's 2002, that I saved. It's on my blog, but we discussed um, the so-called human rights promoter Hubert H. Humphrey, who was actually helped pass the National Security Act in the U.S. that was going to use internment camps against communists based on their political views. So, so Noam Chomsky he's been an activist against the use of locking people up in the U.S. against their human rights. So to make this claim that he would think that people should be locked up, because they didn't get vaccinated is completely against his whole life worldview that he's had since he wrote his very first political article on the fascism, the riot in Spain, and with Franco and stuff. So back in the 30s. So he's been, a lifelong supporter of individual human rights, and as a libertarian socialist, or what was be called an anarchist, but he's actually a libertarian socialist. And so that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I last heard from Noam Chomsky. I corresponded with him maybe a couple of years ago, um, pretty soon before he had his stroke, where he's not able to speak anymore. And so it's sad that people are using his age against him, but that's kind of what happened with the pandemic in general, because 80% of the deaths from the virus were the elderly people, 65 years or older, and so that's been it's been easy for people to like complain about having to wear masks or whatever, but they don't realize that of that people who are 80 years or older were alive during the polio pandemic, and so they remember, that the vaccine was very effective for treat preventing death and um, lifelong injury from the polio. So this is why they're they're having people being required to get vaccinated is not just a way to protect people, but it's prevents the spread of the disease, as we've seen with the return of measles to the U.S. And um, I mean, and they're trying to claim that, well, they'll have to suddenly and support a big pharma. Um, no, there's a big difference between science and big pharma, and obviously, um, it's important to be critical of the scientific research, and I worked in a biomedical lab, not as a researcher, just as a lab assistant. So I was the animal caretaker, and then I did some microscope preparation work and slicing mice brains for um, scanning for genetic. It was a genetic engineering study of cancer, and I didn't like the job. I mean, it was interesting for a summer job, and they wanted me to stay on because it's like nobody wants to take care of mice when they're like popcorn at a certain age, and it has to be a sterile lab, and it was really terrible job to do. But so I quit. But when the season ended, the summer season or whatever. But at any rate, a third of my undergraduate degree was in natural sciences, mainly biology. So I'm pretty familiar with biology, and it's much more complicated than physics or any of the physical sciences. And that's what people don't realize. They don't respect that. But then again, that's why we also have an ecological crisis on Earth, where we're using up the groundwater supply very fast. There was a brand new study on that. I'll post the link in the chat. But they're using the gravity's sensor satellite to then measure the water loss on Earth, and they're determining that the groundwater is being sucked dry so fast for farming that it's become the largest source of ocean sea level rise on Earth, due to the depletion of groundwater then being added back to the rivers that flow back, um, you know, into the oceans, and along with the evaporation that happens from the plants, the agricultural crops. That increases with the heat. So, and then they're saying, well, these areas then have more drought because they're already using up their groundwater supplies. So, and since they already did deforestation, to grow crops, so they're actually having less rain overall. So the drought's increasing, and so it becomes like a feedback cycle um, along the main areas on the planet where what they call the breadbaskets, the interiors of the continent that are actually warmer than the global average. So essentially, it's causing an acceleration of both. groundwater overuse and global warming to lead to complete collapse of the global food supply that could easily happen very soon. It's already happening with so you have like 90 million people in Africa right now are have acute food insecurity because of abrupt global warming because they've been relying on rain for growing food and where you a lot of the interiors of the continents traditionally have relied on what they call green water or rainwater to recharge the groundwater supply and to grow the food. So, like when they talk about the water used for cattle, traditionally a lot of that was from rainwater. But now, of course, they're having to pump the aquifers dry, and so yeah, it's doesn't look good because the global warming is actually much worse than people realize. So if you go to Arctic News, um, you learn about the methane that's being released out of the subsea permafrost. So you have pressurized methane that's then going to be releasing as a abrupt eruption very soon because there's talics that are already melted down to the subsea permafrost, and so that'll release 50 gigatons of methane as a abrupt eruption, and that will then double the atmospheric temperature, and then that would cause increased drought and then increased overuse of water, and so the food supply would collapse even faster. So it could very easily happen within 5 years where there's this complete collapse of the global food supply, and people are unaware of this because everybody's just like freaking out because they don't want to learn science and they want to just talk about I don't know pop stars or whatever people talk about twerking and stuff like that. Um, Working out at the gym or playing their sports, stuff like that. And sure, it's fun. All that stuff's fun. But anyway, so poor Noam Chomsky got lied about, but he's used to being lied about because if you look at his career, he's had a whole career of where he's had to debate people that have lied about him, and he's in fact the email response he gave to me was partly about the lies that people said about him and how people don't really read his books. They don't take the time to read his books. And so, anyway, that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Thanks.